Klein, who's a partner at London-based Local Globe. I have Eileen Burbidge, who's a partner at also London-based Passion Capital. I've got Michael Linz, who's a partner at Golden Gate Ventures in Singapore. So we're moving outside of Europe. And Mark Suster, who's a partner at Upfront Ventures, which is, Mark, I'm not actually sure whereabouts in the US you are, but somewhere in the US.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. There we go. So we've got a nice geographical spread. And I'm also stuck in South London. So a strong London contingent here. So to start with, I guess if we kind of believe the media, Sifted included, every kind of future founder or startup employee is ready to move to Lisbon or the sunny beach equivalent elsewhere, nearish where they used to live. Is that actually bearing out? Is that really what's happening? Or is that just a handful of people and everyone else is just wishful thinking that they or that person who's heading off to sunnier climes to start their beautiful business empire from now on? Saul, you've unmuted. What's going on?
Oh, does that mean
That means you're ready to answer.
What I would say is my mother, used to tell me that, you're more creative in cold weather because, there's nothing to do and you have to stay inside. And, I think Eileen and I would remember, going to Tallinn, where, there were snow drifts sort of 4 feet high and, about 7 hours of sunlight a day. And, that kind of managed to produce Skype and TransferWise. So, I mean, I think it's not about the weather, but it is about, can we build more distributed businesses now? And, is lifestyle a more important aspect of where people want to live and work? And I think, we've been seeing that trend for a while. I mean, the folks at Union Square Ventures talked about digital nomads about, probably 10 years ago. And you have companies like Uber and Airbnb and TransferWise who are kind of part of the nomad stack. And, we're using tools today, like Hopin and Zoom and, Bevy as well, which Mark will tell us about. But, I do think we are living in a different world now. I just don't think it's just about the sunshine.
Let me just say one thing, though. What utter bollocks to say that you're more creative and innovative in cold weather. I mean, look at how much innovation comes from California.
Mark, picking a fight with me is one thing. Picking a fight with my mother, and it's this just to warn you, by the way, it's like a different thing.
I think all Jewish mothers are always right. That said, I think the thing we would agree on, which is innovation can happen anywhere. Distribution right now, it's a wonderful thing for both sides of the equation. Yes, it's real that people want to move to Portugal. Like I just was talking with a guy yesterday from the UK as part of some group called Nerd Forum, telling me just how many young people who don't already have established roots and families and schools and all that stuff are looking at Portugal as a potential gateway for them, or they're looking at the Netherlands or France. As you know, if you follow Twitter in the US, it seems like every entrepreneur and VC is moving to Miami or Austin, Texas. Some amount of that is real, and that's good. And as Saul mentioned, the tools allow you to do that. That couldn't have happened 10 years ago. That's such a net positive for society. But the reality is that clusters of people that work together will continue to work in those locations, and that the real innovation and creativity is not weather dependent. It's the interaction of humans and ideas, and that will always continue to happen in the cities where it has in the past, I believe.
Yeah, we've seen the same in Singapore, where a lot of the investors and even entrepreneurs decided to move to Bali, which is an hour and a half away from us. And Bali's gorgeous, and the weather is amazing. I think Eileen has been, I think. But the issue there was you're living in an amazing environment. You can go surfing on a daily basis. But the community wasn't there. The community was still in Singapore. So people then tended to, after a year or year and a half, decided to move back to Singapore again, because the venture community is there, supportive government is there, the other founders are there. So it was difficult to kind of build a community in Bali itself, although it was gorgeous and the weather is amazing.
So that's the interesting thing, right? That I feel like the same is kind of true. Like a lot of people did seem to go to Lisbon this summer, like startup people in Europe, I mean, but they're still all congregating in the same physical place. And Michael, you just said people went to Bali, but there wasn't the same community. But surely if, you know, the world is distributed now and we have all these amazing tools, like it doesn't matter where we're actually based. And yet still people seem to want to kind of be near each other. Like, what does that tell us? Eileen?
Yeah, I just think there's human psychology, right? So many years of human psychology, and where we're sort of social creatures. I'm actually an introvert, so I haven't minded lockdown as much as, say, you know, other people or my partner and things like that. But I think most people, you know, really thrive off of the energy and the general sort of palpable energy that you get if you're in a room with other really energetic, dynamic people. And so we gravitate towards that energy, whether it's virtually in panels like this or sort of conversations like this, or if we have the chance to do it outside of a pandemic or, you know, with social distancing, we'll do it in a physical space as well. So I do think what the pandemic has done is it's accelerated exactly what, you know, Saul, Michael, and Mark were saying, which is the fact that anyone can start a business wherever they want to in the world. You're no longer really tied to or limited in your options about where you want to be, and that we have the tools now to facilitate remote working so that you can actually have a distributed team as well. Whether or not, you know, that is always or universally going to be just as productive or successful as a team that's actually physically together, you know, I think that remains to be seen. But at least now people have that option, and it's not a foregone conclusion that you have to be centralized and you have to be in a very specific city, for example, to thrive.
And when you're all talking to your kind of portfolio, what challenges and what kind of opportunities are they seeing in this? If people do stay more distributed than they were before, what are going to be and yet some people maybe remain in a like central office or like the core of a company that already exists stays in London or Singapore or Los Angeles or whatever. What's going to be good about that, and what's going to be quite tricky over the next, say, year?
I think I'll go ahead, Saul. I was quick to unmute that time, so I mean, I think I'll.
I'm going to give you
all
the
right, I'll go first, but then you can correct me and sort of fill in the blanks. I was going to say, I think that actually a lot has to be worked out, because especially where what I think is going to dominate is sort of a hybrid model. I think that you'll see, as you described, Amy, there will be a sort of a set of people that will be in a physical location, but then there'll be sort of colleagues or team members that will also be really distributed. So I think what will be really interesting are things like pay, compensation, you know, incentivizing people equally. You know, does somebody get paid the same to live in a city or a town or a place that doesn't have the same cost of living as, say, London or San Francisco? And then if they do, because everyone could choose to work remotely, you know, it's going to bring in all sorts of questions, motivation, you know, performance. If there's less sort of face time or physical presence, how do people, you know, feel engaged? How do they feel motivated? Do they actually feel as invigorated by the mission and things like that? I think there's a lot of this which is going to be logistical and very practical, and a lot which is also really emotional in terms of what really fuels high-performing teams.
So you're instructed to fill in the gaps.
I think that's really spot on. And I mean, I think the hardest thing to know is, and actually the hardest thing for us to figure out, is the sort of the cultural and the values side of things. And I mean, if people haven't read Reed Hastings' book, No Rules Rule, I think, you know, which is really about, I mean, how Netflix has built a pretty extraordinary culture over the last 20 years. The thing I found most fascinating about that book is this sort of the acknowledgement that the lived experience of people in different cities and in different cultures and in different countries is very fundamentally different. So I think it's hard enough when you're a very successful company, you know, translating your values and making them sort of important and relevant across the world. It's you know, easier to disagree with someone in Israel or in New York than it is in Tokyo or Amsterdam. You know, talking to an engineer in Tallinn is different from talking to an engineer in Palo Alto. And I think it's going to be really fascinating, like Eileen said, is, you know, how do companies think about culture and values from the ground up. I mean, it's something that people talk a lot about, but it's really hard to do. And it's especially hard to do when you don't have a homogeneous kind of, universe like a city or a sort of a shared space, bringing people together. So, I mean, I think that's a totally open-ended, unanswered question, but it's going to be really fascinating in all of this.
And is that something, Michael, maybe, is that something your kind of portfolio companies, are they kind of heads of talent or people or the founders, are they already starting to think about how do we work in like a hybrid world, or, are there things they're putting in place or looking into already to kind of make that transition smoother? Or is it still a bit too early to really do anything?
Yeah, just picking off on Saul's point, it's been really difficult for the portfolio companies. I mean, you have to imagine that, running your daily business is hard enough as it is, but you're now facing the fact that you have part of your team members that you've never seen. So I was speaking to I think she's a chief product officer for one of our companies. And she said, I felt weird in the first 4 months because I didn't see the office. I didn't see my teammates. I actually don't know who hired me. I mean, from Zoom, but I don't know them personally. And it felt weird to work for a company where you haven't seen the people yet. So I do feel that a lot of companies are still trying to figure out. And then this hybrid workspace sounds very romantic and ideal, but I do know that a lot of founders are still trying to figure out how it works for them and how they're actually building a culture when part of the team haven't even physically met their other team members.
Mark, what about your companies? How are they kind of getting ready for this future?
Let's be honest, a lot of people starting companies are young to begin with. They're young at managerial talent. They haven't themselves had time to form as natural leaders. And in the best case, when we're all in the same physical location, same culture, we also struggle with leadership and motivation and all these things. So of course, distributed teams makes it harder. I've lived and worked all over the world, despite the accent. I lived in the UK for almost a decade. I lived all across the continent. I lived in Japan. I learned in India, setting up a captive development center that, when someone says yes to you, they don't mean the same thing as someone who says yes in California. And when someone in Israel, is arguing with you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they hate you or they're against you. In fact, if you look at my Twitter stream from this week, I'm at @msuster on Twitter. I posted a thing talking about the psychology of how Jews speak to each other. And Jews often cut each other off mid-sentence. So Saul, feel free to jump in anytime for me. And I just grew up in that culture of arguing and cutting people off and talking and everybody participating. And that cadence is cultural. And then you contrast that, with people who didn't grow up with it. It feels very uncomfortable and people feel discomfort. That's just one microcosm of an example. So I think we're going to be challenged. And as an industry, we need to be more thoughtful about human capital management, whether we're in the same location or distributed.
And what about when we're talking about actually the founders rather than employees? Do you think we'll see, or are you already starting to see more people set up remote first companies like from the off? Because it's one thing, I guess, transitioning an existing company that's hired a bunch of people in a city or a few different cities to a more remote one. But I guess you have like a blank slate if you're starting afresh. Is that actually bearing out that people are, taking this seriously rather than just the few big examples we used to have of this, like GitLab and Buffer? So,
Eileen, do you want to go?
I'm just getting ready.
Michael,
I'm happy to. Yeah, I'm happy to start.
I think only because of the last year.
All right, Eileen first.
Talk over one another and have a conversation.
What was it, Mark? I saw that on Twitter, and it was sort of like it's progressing the conversation or something, like it's building on the conversation, right? That's what we're doing.
I have to say it is, my wife isn't Jewish. She wasn't raised in a Jewish family. We raised our kids Jewish, but she wasn't raised in a Jewish family. And she said to me that whenever she would see me with my siblings, and I have 3 of us, and around my parents, she just like the tension of seeing us argue all the time. I'm like, we're not arguing, that's conversation.
It'd be rude not to be paying attention, right? And to jump in.
So even as a Jew, the trauma of going to your first board meeting in Israel is still profound.
We should have another panel on this, by the way. But to Amy's question about whether or not founders are setting up sort of remote first businesses now, I think they are, because this last year they were forced to. So like Michael was saying in that case where he was talking to the chief product officer, I mean, any company that was started, after March in London last year, they had to be remote first, and those people didn't get to meet, people that they might have hired or chosen to work with face to face, or they were kind of skirting the rules. So I think it was a forced situation anyway, but they probably did it even though they all lived in London and sort of anticipated the chance to see each other after lockdown is probably still the majority.
But I think one thing I would say in all of this thread, Amy, which is all about, distribution and remote, and, there are very few people I've spoken to in the last year when given the chance to go out of their house and see other people again, and meet up and engage in a social format that's not on Zoom or Hopin or Cosmos or whatever. And we see the same thing with founders. Founders are looking forward to being back with their teams in person, not necessarily in the same formats. Founders still want to go for a walk. If they're having a problem, they'd still like to, have some in-person time and in-person interaction. And that's why, I'm a strong believer that, when we get back to, some kind of post-COVID experience, like Eileen said earlier, the sort of the buffet of options we can use to build our lives, to build our businesses, has changed and increased. But I think there's still some things, including, physical proximity and meeting face to face and in person, that are still really important. And just a sort of a personal reflection. When we were at Skype, we had a pretty distributed team. It wasn't as distributed as, say, MySQL or WordPress, which are kind of the GitLabs for those of us that are 50 or more. But we still got together at least once a quarter in person, and probably, for a longer space of time, because, that sort of serendipity and, accidental conversations make a lot of a big difference. And I don't think that that's going to go away. So I think, like with everything in tech, we've kind of, the pendulum goes this way, and, we're going to kind of, also remember why we like to get out the house and see other people as well.
So does the same then translate for investing, where at the moment people have been saying this, it's level playing field, a founder anywhere can more easily get investment from an investor everywhere, because you're maybe less reliant on kind of like in-person networks and meeting people in that way. But if we're all really kind of, most of us want to spring back to you guys having board meetings that are actually around a board table, and maybe getting pitched to actually in your office, do those kind of potential kind of leveling the playing field benefits that some people have seen from remote, will they not actually hang around? Michael?
I haven't seen the benefit, to be honest. I don't know how it is for the others, but I haven't seen the benefit in terms of the moment when Singapore went into what they call a circuit breaker last year, April, which lasted about 3 months. So between April and June, kids were at home. You couldn't travel. It was kind of indoors. You could go out for a walk, but that was kind of it. We switched back to doing due diligence, meeting founders over Zoom. I noticed that most of the deals we did in that period were founders we already knew before. So I just don't see where there's all of a sudden a level playing field, because kind of we're all on Zoom. Founders still gravitate towards the investors that they talked to at a conference last year, that they already know within the network, or someone might reference someone else because they had a good experience. So in that sense, it still felt in that sense similar. in terms of the founders that we were speaking to. And sort of to the previous point, I think for Asia, what has been extra difficult, it's not, now it's good, by the way. The countries went on lockdown very early, so all kind of between last year, April till June. So companies were literally forced to sort of shut down, work from home instantly, and they had zero time to think about culture, hybrid work, or they just didn't have the luxury. It was literally, you work from home right now, that's the rule, and nothing else. So we can open up the country again later in the year.
Does anyone disagree? Has anyone seen this beautiful?
I'm not going to say disagree, but let me just tell you how things are different in California, perhaps, which is this. I think we have to acknowledge, in California at least, I can say, there's a higher cadence of meetings between VCs and entrepreneurs. Why is that? Well, first of all, as a VC, you're spending less time traveling, less time in board meetings, less time doing bullshit admin. And that frees you up to expand your mind and take more Zoom calls with people. I think the culture of taking a 30-minute meeting when nobody's traveling to get there is much easier. So, people, I think meeting times are shortening. Like sometimes I'm sheepish to ask for an hour now, whereas like in person, it was always an hour. And, if you look at Calendly as a booking engine, they have 15, 30, and 45-minute slots. And whenever founders reach out to me, they never ask for more than 30 minutes anymore. It's like 30-minute slots, right? So the culture really is changing. I think we have to acknowledge it. Whether it's permanent or not, time will tell. So also, because VCs are more available, entrepreneurs are, people who are good at hustling and networking are having an easier time setting up 12 meetings all in a row. But the flip side is true, which is finding and picking an investor really quickly without really truly getting to know them is a double-edged sword, because even if they invest in your company, if you don't fundamentally know them, you're effectively getting married without meeting someone in person. And you're getting married to someone with no divorce clause. Like if they invest in your company, like there is no divorce. So, I guess it's like marriage in Ireland in the 90s. And so, look, at the end of the day, culture's changing, and I see it right in front of me super fast. We have invested in many companies now over the course of the last year where I have never met the founders in person. I have 2 employees in my company now that I have never met in person. That's mind-blowing for me. So it's changing, and I think the changes are permanent. They will revert back to some kind of norm, but it's, I think it's here to stay.
I mean, I think the big unknown here, which I totally agree with what you're saying, Mark, is how long cycles still are. And actually, the cycle of really building a great company is still 7 to 12 years. And, there's no company that goes through that journey without real trauma and real issues. And I think, what the real test of any relationship is not when everything's going well. It's, when things aren't going so well. And, that to me is where, we're going to crave proximity again. And, even if that proximity is sort of time zone based, because it's challenging to sort of have a kind of a long distance relationship, and a lot of that is to do with being on different time zones. So I also believe that proximity is not just about travel time, it's also about time zone. And I think that's something else that we need to think about in this distributed world, is that even if you are not going to be there to see someone in person, at least being able to talk to them within time windows that work with your life outside of work, I think is also an important consideration.
So does this mean that another thing I feel has occupied the minds of lots of people over the past year is the Americans are coming to Europe, that the big US VC firms are heading over here, and they were, literally opening up offices, and then COVID came along. what you've just said tells me that, but unless they're actually in Europe, they're not on the same time zone, and it's people still want to meet in person. How much of a threat to you European-based investors are and Mark, how much of an opportunity is there in Europe now? What battle's going to play out?
We've been working with Mark for years, and we've been investing in the US for years. I mean, Index did Index invade San Francisco 6 or 7 years ago? At Index we made 61 investments in the US before we had an office there. Sequoia have been investing in the UK and Europe for decades. So I mean, I think at a certain point in time, you stop being a tourist and you put roots down. But I don't think a lot of this stuff is that new, quite frankly.
Could I pick up on what Saul said earlier about culture, which is it's hard enough in your own culture with people that grew up with a similar cadence of communication to have a judgment on what represents quality of a person as an individual, as a thinker. The minute you cross cultural boundaries, your ability to really assess skills and capabilities goes down dramatically. So it's really not just geography, but I will say this. We at Upfront are spending a lot more time looking at European deals. We've been doing cross-border, as Saul said, we've been doing it for 20 years. Our founder is French, and he's still a full-time partner. We've done 10 cross-border deals between France and the US in like the last several years alone. I lived in France, I lived in Italy, I lived in Spain. Like, we're open for business. I have some great investments in the UK right now. We've done good cross-border with the Nordic region and Scandinavia. By the way, like our newest partner, she joined a year and a half ago, is from Singapore. So we're open for global relationships and global business and global investments. I don't think that's a threat. I think it's an opportunity because, the biggest companies have to think globally.
Eileen, are you feeling the heat?
No, I don't think we're feeling more heat because of people coming in and investing in the UK. As Saul, and Mark were saying, and I think it's about 10 years since I first met Mark in London. So I'm aging all of us, but I think it's good. I will say what's different is that there's never been more capital available to entrepreneurs here in London and across Europe than there is today. So we should acknowledge that while, the collaboration and the sort of cross-border awareness that, everybody on this call already has, it still means the volumes we're seeing today are absolutely unprecedented. And I think that is a good thing. And I do think that's a reflection of the topic of this panel, which is that, we're not confined to borders or to strict sort of regions anymore, either for working or for teams or for setting up companies or for investing.
But I mean, I agree with that. To make a slightly, not contrarian, but maybe kind of additional point here is that, arguably, I mean, there's a great statistics that, there's a Morgan Stanley report that kind of was doing the rounds last year about the macro shift from public to private markets, that's been going on for decades now. And there's one sentence in it that really kind of drew my attention, which is a 1% swing in pension fund allocation to venture is the entire US venture industry. A 1% swing in pension fund allocation is the entire US venture industry. So arguably, not only is there going to be a lot, more capital coming into the markets in the next 20 years, what that would suggest to me, which is like almost a terrible and heretical thing to say, is there not enough investors. Because, if you think about literally just increasing the size of the entire US venture industry, which is the biggest venture industry in the world, the same again by a 1% allocation swing, you're talking about a lot more investors. And the thing that then worries me is, what level of training and support do investors have? I mean, historically, we talk about venture in medieval terms, like it's an apprenticeship business. If you can't afford the Kaufman Fellowship, which is sort of 70, 80 grand, and you've got to fly to California, there's no way to sort of to develop in the industry. And at this point, you know, if venture is going to be managing that much money, and if venture-backed companies are as fundamental as they seem to be to sort of the global economic ecosystem, you know, I think 8 out of 10 of the world's largest companies were venture-backed and didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. We've also got to think about, you know, how we sort of evolve, you know, the venture business, because we're gonna need a lot more investors, and they're gonna need to keep getting a lot better, and not just in Europe, everywhere.
Michael, do you think is the next generation being trained up adequately, or will all this capital come in and be managed by crappy, inexperienced investors?
Thanks for the question. No, I would say, you know, in general, as an example, we've seen the likes of, I mean, Sequoia has an office in Singapore, Lightspeed has an office in Singapore. There's kind of more coming. I think Ray Dalio is thinking of moving his family office to Singapore, and there's a few others. I do feel that there is a humongous influx of capital. I would also have to say that a large portion of that capital, I'd say around 70%, at least here in the Singapore market, is going to known managers. And sort of what you'll see is that the existing managers will have teams that'll break off and start their own business and start their own fund. And I think that's a great development. I always like to see that there's at least enough young talent kind of trying to make the jump after they spend, you know, 5-6 years at one of the other funds. So I feel, you know, at least from an Asia perspective, there's a lot of training at the venture firms themselves. Funny enough, Saul, you mentioned Kaufman Fellows. I do feel that if you look at sort of that institutionalized training, that's where Asia still is lacking. I mean, for us, you know, we still have to fly to the US. If there is kind of proper training, there's nothing similar we have in Asia, unfortunately. I think you're
on mute, Amy.
Thanks. The other question I think Mark wanted me to ask, I wanted to throw this in, is the B bomb, the Brexit word. Is that actually, Eileen, Saul, you're maybe best placed to answer this one. Is it actually having an impact yet? Are startups in the UK finding it harder to get talent? What are the real actual concerns that people have that aren't just things people chat about in Clubhouse or newspapers? Like, what are the real actual Brexit implications for startups right now that are actually apparent and not just hypothetical?
I mean, to answer that specific question, I think the real implications probably affect e-commerce businesses the most. So we're already seeing, you know, companies and customers sort of complaining about extra tariffs or duties that are going between goods that are coming either into the UK or outside of. And so if somebody had a pan-European e-commerce business or anything that had supply chain coming from the continent, I think they are dealing with real implications. I would, however, say that I think at least we're on a path to getting clarity with some of these regulations or these changes. And the last couple of years, the uncertainty of it all was, I think, just as damaging as what anyone else, you know, would have anticipated. And so it's great to finally be on the other side of it. Hopefully we're going to get more clarification more quickly, you know, in coming months. Obviously, I think the pandemic probably, it didn't mute the implications of Brexit, but I think it's kind of absorbed it all. And so it's hard now to distinguish what is directly attributable to Brexit and what's directly attributable to what all countries have had to do in terms of, you know, locking down, for example, because of COVID-19. But I think that's the first sort of real world implication that I've seen. And of course, for financial services businesses, there's a question about whether or not there'll be regulatory equivalents if they were relying on being regulated. I don't know, Saul probably has even more examples or thoughts too.
No, I mean, I think those are the two areas that we've seen people having challenges with. I think, you know, the main thing that's changed is, you know, is from uncertainty to certainty. And I think, you know, most companies, you know, I mean, this was like a train crash, you know, that we saw coming for 4 years. So, you know, 3-4 years. So I think most people, while not entirely prepared, because you never know exactly what it's going to mean operationally until you get to sort of the other side. But, you know, portfolio companies that were in fintech, you know, had to open up, you know, subsidiaries in Lithuania or, wherever. But you know, everyone saw it coming, and I think, you know, everyone now just feels we're on the other side of it. And you know, I think this has always been the attitude from the day after the referendum is, you know, you make lemonade. That's what founders do.
Yeah, making lemonade is fine. I, as a British citizen and US citizen and someone who lives in California, I think there's negative implications for the UK and for California of the current environment, the Brexit and California tax policy. If I look at Brexit, you can't make an assessment in 1 year or 2 years. There's still going to be great companies and great founders in the UK, and that will always be the case. But it's the hidden companies that aren't created in the UK that won't be picked up by the policymakers because some young founder in the south of France or in Italy or in Portugal or in the Ukraine who would have come to the UK to build the next Skype or whatever they would have built out of the UK won't do it. And I'm not saying nobody will do it, but I'm saying there are people who would be attracted to the UK as probably what would have and should have remained the best place to innovate in Europe. And, you know, that lessens it. In California, we're seeing the impact of, you know, aggressive tax policies. And, you know, as someone with 2 kids in high school here, I'm not going anywhere. But if I were a 28-year-old thinking about where I wanted to spend the next 10 years working my ass off, I might give a harder thought to Austin, Texas, or Miami because, you know, if I'm going to work my ass off, I have to think about cost of living. I have to think about my future wealth creation. And so policy matters. And I think the UK has shot itself in the foot. But the truth is, it's already done. So there's no, you know, make lemonade out of it. I agree. And hopefully, you know, I think the UK investors will increasingly look to broaden to the continent also to invest dollars there.
All right. So we've only got a few more minutes, but that's a good lead on to my next question, which is, so if anyone can set up a company anywhere or move anywhere to work for tech, where would you recommend they look? Which locations are good in terms of talent or tax? Saul thinks weather doesn't matter. Mark thinks sunny climes are great.
No, Saul thinks creativity comes from freezing.
Good point. Sorry, I misremembered.
Yeah, I said, that's what my mother said. Now, you know, last time I checked, not every son agreed with everything their mother said.
Sorry to bring Saul's mum back into this, but where would you suggest people started companies? Michael, I've heard good things about Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, I moved here, I moved here 8 years ago. So I can definitely attest to it's been an amazing journey. I do feel that, you know, using the word ecosystem, it's honestly getting better and better. It is, if you look at it from a distance, it is impressive what the Singapore government is doing to not only attract talent, but also to attract capital, to make sure that when you are raising your family here, that, you know, it's a very, very safe place. They've been, you know, apart from the migrant workers, of course, but overall, the response to COVID has been swift and really good. Yeah, if I were 28, which is a very long time ago, and I had the opportunity to build a business in Singapore, I would 100% say yes.
So, where's your where would you send people off to? Well,
I mean, I have to say I'm really pretty long on London. But if you were asking me, you know, 20, 30 years from now, I'd say, you know, probably Nigeria.
Why?
Why? It's going to be the 5th largest economy in the world by around, you know, 2040. There's an enormous young talent pool, not just in Nigeria, but in Africa. And you're seeing that with companies like Andela and Flutterwave. And I think, you know, time zones also matter. And I think, you know, as strong as California is, as strong as, you know, the Eastern Seaboard is, as strong as like Hong Kong or Singapore is, you know, the concentration of sort of intellectual and economic capital in the time zone between London and Tel Aviv is really profound. And I think, you know, when Africa becomes, you know, a meaningful force as part of that, you know, we're going to see a lot of changes. And, you know, it's the youngest kind of fastest growing economies on the planet. And, you know, I think companies like Andela and Flutterwave have shown, you know, just, you know, what remarkable talent there is there.
Amazing. Mark, where would you send off a potential founder to find their
I give this advice all the time. So I always say to founders, the starting point is choose where you want your life to be. Choose where you want to plant roots and have friends and build a community, and then figure out how to build a business from there. If possible, I would choose a larger cluster because it's easier with the human capital to build deep, meaningful relationships and to hire talent and do all the other things. But if you're in the US, there's 8 to 15 spots one could choose. If you're in Europe, there's 8 to 15 spots one could choose. I would also be thoughtful about where your advantages are. Like, no matter, you know, how international I think my outlook is, I never have an advantage in France or Italy or places where I didn't grow up and don't have the same cultural advantages. So I was always going to do better in the UK than I was going to do in Italy. And I think I do better in California than I did in the UK. So, you know, I think moving to Nigeria is fine if you're young enough, or if you have some linkages between Africa and the continent or Africa and the US. Awesome. I totally agree with the long-term trend and population growth. But for example, me just moving to India, for example, and saying India is the future, I want to plant seeds in India, I don't have a comparative advantage in India. So I would also start with that.
And Eileen, final say, where would you send someone?
Final say is, I just think Mark summed it up really, really brilliantly. I think that's fantastic advice, and he's absolutely right. I think people do their best work when they're happy and when they're fulfilled, and if they're sort of looked after and comfortable and have a support network, whether it's social, professional, otherwise. So go off of that. But also, like Saul, and very conveniently and selfishly, I'm very long, you know, on the UK and London in particular as well.
Amazing. Right, we're out of time, but thank you so much. I feel like we've got life advice, insight into Jewish family communication. We've learned that it's easier to get time with VCs perhaps than it used to be, but you maybe already need to know them to get that time. And distribution is great, but we do kind of like hanging out. So that is probably what's going to happen again soon. And there's more capital around, but are there enough good VCs to manage it? So lots of food for thought. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm now handing over to Maya Palmer. I've forgotten the title of her talk, I'm sorry, but she will explain what it is any moment now. So thanks, everyone, and bye-bye from me.